Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Amer. Pleased to be with you here and share with you some thoughts about the new challenges of conducting trials under the world of COVID. Before I start, I would like to make sure that we all understand that there's the opinions that I share with you are basically my thinking and not reflecting any of the clients I've represented or worked for in the last in my career, 28 years. So it's basically the personal thoughts. An overview of what I would like to share with you, some facts and figures. There is assessment which is absolutely critical in conducting trials or continuing to conduct trials. The informed consent process, which obviously is a bit challenging, more challenging now than it used to be, distribution of the investigational medicinal product, and trial monitoring, as well as, of course, safety reporting, and any lessons learned, or rather being learned, in fact. So some facts and figures. As of the 27th of October, a few days ago, there have been, as we know, over 43.5 million cases worldwide, with a total deaths of nearly 1,200,000 in over 120 countries. So it's basically as global as one can imagine a pandemic is. At the moment, or at the time that I've done the research for this presentation, there were 334,000 registered trials around the world. Now, out of this number, there seems to be only 15% which are actually actively recruiting patients. Of course, the number before, it didn't used to be all the 334,000 recruiting, but of course 15% is very, very low number of trials that are recruiting. So you can imagine that the impact has been quite substantial. Of course, as a life industry, we cannot abandon our patients, we cannot abandon our trials. And we have to find ways to manage that. There seems to be certain trials with certain characteristics that are more impacted and hence delayed than other trials. These tend to be related to certain characteristics with the patient population. For example, vulnerable populations, the elderly, the immunocompromised, and those, of course, with respiratory problems. Risk of so-called acquired infection is in high patients, of course, and the increased risk for medical staff to deliver the treatment due to the aerosolization. So any trials which tend to have close contact with the patients, obviously they tend to be more affected once you've done the risk assessment. The endpoint type of the trial tends to have an impact as well. So any endpoint that can only be done in person, the subject having to be at the site, or using the hospital premises or equipment like imaging base, of course, these all could be affected. Especially when the hospitals tend to be preoccupied with the treatment of COVID, with the highs and lows that we have seen so far. Indication of the trial tends to be also a factor with minor safety or quality of life implications for patients, where the patient's environment strongly impacts the therapeutic success, for example, in psychiatric indications. Now, if a trial requires a lot of resources, obviously that is a critical thing in most institutes and clinics and hospitals, especially teaching hospitals. The site locations tend to have an effect as well, with sites located within hospitals or tertiary academic centers, and of course in areas where there are high COVID cases. as we are seeing nowadays that density tend to vary substantially from place to place. And of course, that means that the availability of the staff to do the trials will also be impacted. Funny enough, the mechanism of action of therapies also have an impact. For example, therapies, regimens that render patients more susceptible to COVID, like chemotherapy, affecting their immune system. Of course, these tend to be impacted much more than others. Now, operative procedures that are long or difficult, and if conducted in personal protective equipment, of course, that everybody is empathizing with health staff who are having to wear PPE the majority of their days, and I think we all seen the effects that it has on them. And if you consider on top of that the summer period where it is really hot, and it could even affect the outcomes from these procedures, might be even worse than normal outcomes. So you might even get data affected by it. The trial size, trials with in rare diseases where a patient accrual is difficult as it is, and of course in a pandemic it's going to be affected even more. Trials in progress, which were in progress when the pandemic started, they tended to, with patients fully enrolled, of course, they were less impacted than trials which were at the beginning of them. And of course, this may change with the crisis, and as we are being told that we are going through a second wave now. Trials that may also face protocol violations, the patient's loss, that could affect the rigor of the efficacy and the safety data statistically. We don't know whether that will actually in the end affect the regulatory approval of the study. So that's another challenge. In trending wise, we have seen that most biopharma companies, they have primarily focused on either pausing the study or delaying the trials in patient recruitments till things clarify. Regulatory authorities, of course, they acknowledge that the changes to the protocol and patient visits are necessary to protect both the patients as well as the health workers and researchers. Risk assessment is basically absolutely key here, and a robust one is an absolute must. So a risk-benefit assessment on a trial-by-trial basis for the aforementioned reasons that factors are related to the trial design that really could affect everything. So it has to be trial by trial, and it needs to take into account the participant population, as we said, the IMP mode of action, of course, the trial design, how complicated is it, and how easy is it to maneuver things and change that. We need to assess also the need for COVID testing prior and during and even after. And perhaps there might be, depending on local regulations, there might be some additional consent needed to do that if we are asking the patients to be tested. Overall, changes are hoped for, or some of us might say dream to that it would allow studies to continue. Of course, all the stakeholders, the sponsors, the investigators, the ethics committees, and DMCs, if they have been recruited, they should assess the participants' safety, welfare, and also whether an action is needed on a trial-by-trial basis. Whether COVID-related limitations on protocol implementations pose a new safety risk to the participants, that has to be obviously identified, mitigated by amending the study procedures. Now, if some of these assessments for efficacy are likely to be delayed or missed, Could this affect the study integrity as a whole? I think this is a key part of the risk assessment. Sponsors, of course, will not be required to report every single deviation prior to the annual reports. Otherwise, it will become mission impossible for both the sponsors as well as the regulators. Adjustments may need to be reflected in the statistical analysis plan, and this is really key because it's all about whether the data at the end of the day, the product of the trial, is meaningful, is acceptable to the regulators. So that risk analysis has to have at its heart the statistical analysis impact. Additional statistical analysis may around the sensitivity, the safety and treatment effects pre, post, and during COVID would probably pay dividends if at all possible. Scientific advice is paramount to be sought before implementing the changes to the protocol or the statistics of the study. Risk assessment impact on ongoing trials, they need to be conducted on blinded data. There doesn't need to be unblinding by independent committees. Not necessarily just the DMC. You could have a steering committee that could be assessing that, as long as they involve the right SMEs, the subject matter experts, of course. There's a need to assess which data is needed in real time and which data could possibly be collected later without having any effect retrospectively. Assessing the data integrity related to the unmonitored data. How would not monitoring certain data affect the data integrity? That should be part of the risk assessment. Assessment, of course, approach to documentation. Of course, everybody's been told documentation, but of course it has to be done in a risk-based manner. So in summary, with regard to risk assessment, the outcome could be halting the recruitment altogether of the new participants immediately, unless, of course, we can, based on the risk assessment, determine that the trial can continue without impacting or being impacted, of course, by COVID. Another outcome would be to continue with different approaches, and these are the changes that we mentioned earlier. Another outcome could be, unfortunately, might be to stop or suspend the trial, withdraw the participants as long as, of course, we ensure that they will receive the care that they need from their GPs or their treating physician if we are to terminate them from the trial. Put risk mitigations in place. That could be another option. So with risk mitigation, the trial could continue. So it all depends, of course, on that risk assessment. One of the things that can be adapted is to conduct informed consent via telemedicine, televisits. There are a few names flying out there at the moment. Remote consent processes, they can be developed and they can be acceptable by the authorities. With ethics approvals, of course, physicians and staff, they could conduct consent process with potential participants via the phone. As long as certain aspects, of course, are taken into account, like the documentation and confirmation of the identity and various other aspects, of course, without going into too much detail. Mailing, of course, after that, the consent forms to the subjects with a letter and staff contact information so that they could read the informed consent at their at their homes, and then they are encouraged to, as usual, of course, to contact the site staff and ask any questions that they may have, and then send the signed informed consent by post, keeping one copy to themselves, of course. Now, patients, they need to be informed about any risk linked to the participation. If there are any risk identified during the risk assessment, they need to be informed of that potential risk. Potentially the change in their benefit risk could be investigated. Investigators should maintain contact with the trial subjects, of course, as per research requirement, and keep them informed of any new information that is received from the sponsor. A few aspects regarding the distribution of the medicinal products, of course. We have to assess the continuity of the supply and manufacture of the IMP. This is crucial, and it would be very sad, of course, that while we have mitigated all risk and without ensuring that there is a supply which can be affected, has been ensured. Develop a contingency measures to maintaining that manufacture. And of course, that is more challenging now than ever. But of course, it will pay dividends if anything goes wrong with your main supplier. Consider the shelf life. If the treatment schedule or if the site is unable to properly store the IMP for the required period. So revising the shelf life might be prudent. Developing a process for the safe shipment to the subjects, that could be acceptable too if it meets the applicable regulatory requirements. For example, in the UK, the MHRA does not require substantial amendment for doing that, which is pretty surprising actually, but it's actually the case. Should do a risk assessment and record this internally of course, shipping the IMP directly to the subjects. Of course, participants, they must consent verbally to providing their contact details, because that is something would be new. Sponsors, they have to carry out procedures necessary to assess the safe and appropriate use by the subjects on their own of the IMP if required, if it is beyond the simple tablets, for example. Should consider if any training is required to administer the IMP, perhaps. Any storage conditions requirement and how they are managed during posting, assurance about the integrity of the product, of course, during posting, and the stability of the IMP. Will it withstand the duration of the posting and weather conditions and so forth. Mechanism for confirming that the subjects have received the IMP and not received by somebody else, of course, is important. Does the IMP need to be signed for by the subject when they receive it? That's really important. Now, if accountability is not really crucial to that trial, then IMP can be destroyed, of course, at the site rather than exposing everyone to unnecessary risk of virus by sending the unused medication or the rest of the medication, or the subjects, in fact. If accountability is important, for example, for controlled medications, then this might necessitate the sponsor to consider other ways of mitigating the risk, while mitigating the risk of exposure to the virus by sending the IMP back. Monitoring, remote monitoring, of course, has become more valid and more important than ever before. But that, of course, carries its own challenges. For example, the direct access to the patient's records away from the site could create confidentiality issues. Will the monitor be accessing the records in an open plan in public place? Of course, that could be a risk to confidentiality. And even when they are accessing it from home, are they sitting somewhere private from family and so forth, to make sure that this is respected? The device should have its own security and passwords and so forth. And for example, instructions to forbid any printing, any emailing, downloading of records, and all these functions can be disabled within the system so that the monitor cannot actually do them if they do them by mistake. Participants would need to consent to any identifiers, of course, leaving their usual clinical site, and they should be assured that we are doing everything to preserve the confidentiality. Using phone calls instead of protocol-directed in-person visits is acceptable where it is possible. And simultaneous documentation, of course, of the phone call is an absolute must. When it comes to safety reporting, the regulators insist that, of course, we have to still meet the regulatory timelines for reporting. If we are changing anything in the procedure, we have to assess whether it's going to impact the benefit risk of the trial. Any additional data row for patients infected with COVID would be a very good idea in the database. And we have, of course, to distinguish data-wise from the quarantine measures and patients having to who have actually contracted the virus. Separate summary tables for COVID-related adverse events and any such adverse events leading to death, and of course any deaths that result from COVID infection, that they have to be reported. If the patient unfortunately contracts COVID while in a clinical trials, then these patients, they may introduce, of course, COVID-related. Now, would this have an impact on the validity of and the efficacy of the and safety data? This should be assessed, of course, during the risk assessment. Periodic reports such as DSUR, if it is to be delayed, provide a rationale in the covering letter when submitted, rather than asking the regulators. They are inundated with calls and requests, so they only expect a rationale in the accompanying letter. Serious adverse events, they could be reported to the sponsor via the phone call, followed by a written report. So that's kind of a flexibility that the sponsors could consider. Could consider processes to integrate data directly from emails into the safety or even clinical databases. Changes, of course, to the way that we record SAE, they have to be done, but they do not require substantial amendments from certain authorities like the MHRA. Some lessons being learned rather than haven't been learned, because we're still learning a lot. Patients entered into entering the clinical areas should wear masks and have the usual requirement for PPE. This is of course, we're talking about at the clinical site. This is in this slide, everything is really not up beyond what we are required to do when we go to any clinic anyway. Clarity is key here in the responsibility and the instructions to the site as to what to do, what to do. And of course, what not to do is just as useful information as what to do. So what is not to do? No prospective protocol waivers. That's not permitted by the authorities. Do not bypass the eligibility process due to difficulties in assessing the subjects and carrying out the required safety test. If a patient's safety is at risk because they cannot complete certain evaluations, then discontinue that subject, and if necessary. Trial subjects and research personnel safety, they take priority over everything. Risk benefit for all studies. Protocol procedures that carry risk, they have to be postponed to later stage. And sponsors, of course, they have to inform investigators of any changes to the trials. Now, sponsors to acquire new solutions to resolve how do they acquire data from patients. Alternatives for planned safety assessment, collection of endpoints, and so forth that we have mentioned earlier. For example, having a local lab, sending lab kits to the subjects. Sponsors should pre-plan how systematic deviations, of course, will be captured. Documentation is key, and that will not be forgiven, of course, if it's not done. And of course, we have to keep the subjects informed of any changes with regard to the risk. Document everything. This was before COVID. During COVID, it does not change, basically. If shipping the IMP to the subjects, consider the storage requirements, of course, the integrity of the IMP, and so forth. Now, implement risk-based monitoring is if you haven't done so. Flexibility for the research team, remote working to protect the research workers, remote participant screening and informed consent. And of course, to be successful, we have to find new ways to deliver our trials and be successful. Thank you very much.